Greetings, fellow history lovers. Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution podcast series, which we examine and unfold critical turning points that forge new paths in human history in chronological order. It's really great to have you with us again. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, trying to shut down an entire country today.
Oh, man.
Right, like no trains moving, no cargo leaving the ports.
Yeah, zero electricity flowing to the factory.
Exactly. And imagine doing all of that, coordinating literally 4 million people, but, and here's the kicker, without a single cell phone.
Wow.
No internet, no email, and honestly, without even basic legal protections. Today, we're taking a deep dive into how a massive, highly coordinated group of people did exactly that.
And why their own leaders were just absolutely terrified of what they had just pulled off.
Yeah, terrified. It's a staggering historical reality.
It really is. We are looking at a truly sweeping, just incredibly turbulent timeline today.
We absolutely are. So, for today's deep dive, our core mission is tracing the dramatic history of the British labor movement. And what makes this so critical is that we aren't just looking at, any labor movement.
Right.
We're examining the oldest organized labor movement in the entire world.
The absolute blueprint.
Yeah, the blueprint for industrial organization. Now, to do this, we are pulling from a very specific stack of sources today. We're looking at archives from a publication called In Defense of Marxism,
which features writings by authors like Rob Sewell, Mike Hogan, Alan Woods, and a few others.
Right, which means, crucially, we are looking at this history through a very distinct, highly theorized lens.
Yes, a heavily Marxist analytical perspective.
Exactly. And that brings me to a crucial disclaimer for you, the listener, because these sources come from In Defense of Marxism. They naturally provide that Marxist viewpoint on historical events.
Right, which is important to state up front.
Definitely. We need to be crystal clear right out of the gate in this deep dive. We are not taking sides.
Nope.
We are not endorsing these political views, nor are we condemning them. Our goal is strictly analytical.
We're acting as neutral explorers here.
Exactly, just to objectively examine how these specific authors interpret history, how they frame these massive societal shifts, and how they construct their arguments against capitalism, imperialism, and the ruling class.
Right. We're basically treating this theoretical framework as an object of study. We want to understand the architecture of their arguments.
Yeah.
But to do that effectively, especially if you, the listener, are completely new to world history or, Marxist theory, we really need to establish a very solid baseline first.
Oh, for sure. We can't just dive into the deep end of 19th century industrial politics without knowing how to swim through the terminology.
Exactly. There are two terms we will be bumping into constantly today, and those are class struggle and the means of production.
Yes, please give us the foundation. Because, if I'm totally new to this, a phrase like the means of production sounds like, I don't know, something out of a dusty 19th century economics textbook.
It really does, yeah.
What does it actually mean for someone waking up and going to work, whether that's in 1880 or like today?
Okay, let's break it down to the physical reality. In the simplest terms, the means of production are the non-human inputs you need to create wealth.
Okay.
So think of the actual factories, the heavy machinery, the tools, the agricultural land, the raw materials. And today, it would be the servers and digital infrastructure.
Okay. The physical stuff.
Right. And under a capitalist system, as Marxist theory argues, these means of production are privately owned by a very small group of people, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie.
Okay, so they hold the deed to the factory.
Exactly. But those owners don't actually operate the heavy machinery themselves.
Right, they aren't on the floor.
No, they don't toil in the fields or assemble the products. The people who do the actual physical and mental work to create value are the working class or the proletariat.
Got it.
And they don't own the factories, right? They only own their own ability to work, their labor power.
Okay, their time and energy.
Exactly. And because they don't own the machines, they have to sell their labor power to the owners in exchange for a wage just to survive.
So basically, one group owns the stuff that makes the money, and the other group does the physical work to make the stuff.
Yes.
It's a fundamental division of reality.
Precisely. And that dynamic inevitably leads us to the second core concept, which is class struggle.
Okay.
Because the owners want to maximize their profit, which is just the structural demand of capitalism, they are naturally incentivized to keep wages as low as possible.
And working hours as long as possible.
Right. The cheaper the labor, the higher the profit margin. Meanwhile, The workers want the exact opposite.
Naturally.
They want better wages to feed their families, safer conditions so they don't literally die on the job, and, more time for themselves.
Right, so these aren't just two groups having a polite disagreement. Their core interests are mathematically opposed.
Exactly. They cannot both win. If wages go up, profit margins go down.
It's a zero-sum game.
It is. And this constant underlying structural friction and the open conflicts that erupt from it, like unionization drives, strikes, or even full-blown revolutions, is what Marxists call the class struggle.
Okay.
It's not an accident. It is the engine that, in their view, drives all of human history forward.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we think about the very early British labor movement through that lens, I picture it less like a modern political campaign and more like trying to build a survival network in a highly hostile environment.
That's a great way to put it.
It's kind of like a grassroots tech startup, but starting entirely underground, entirely illegal, but driven by this desperate need to fix a broken system, or even like trying to organize a massive prison break.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right, where the guards control the food, the schedule, the locks, the very laws of the facility. You have to convince everyone to risk solitary confinement or, in the Victorian era, starvation and imprisonment just to demand a slightly larger ration.
Yeah, the stakes were literally life and death.
You had to invent the very concept of organized pushback from scratch.
That is a highly functional way to look at it. You were describing a raw power imbalance, and that perfectly sets the stage for the 19th century, which is where our sources begin.
Let's get into it.
So, the authors point to the birth of the first workers' party in human history, which was the Chartist Association.
Okay.
This was a mass movement entirely dedicated to the enfranchisement of working people. They were fighting for the right to vote.
Just the basic right to vote?
Exactly. The right to have a political voice in a system that actively, legally excluded them.
I want to pause on that because, today we think of voting as just a standard civic duty.
Right.
But back then, granting the vote to a factory worker was viewed by the establishment as an existential threat. Like, why was the ruling class so terrified of simply letting people cast a ballot?
Because of the numbers.
Yeah.
If you apply the Marxist lens we just established, the ruling class understood that they were a tiny minority.
Ah, right. Math again.
Yes. If the massive working class gained political power through the vote, what would stop them from voting to change the property laws?
Wow, yeah.
What would stop them from voting to literally take control of the factories themselves? The Chartist movement wasn't just asking for a piece of paper in a ballot box.
It was a threat.
It was a demand to fundamentally alter who held power in society.
And the language used to describe these early pioneers in our sources is just incredibly vivid. There's a quote from a Chartist leader named Fergus O'Connor.
Oh, yes.
And he describes the movement as being built by trade unions of the downtrodden, the entirely unskilled workers specifically, those with, quote, blistered hands and unshorn chins.
What's fascinating here is the deliberate, almost visceral focus on the physical toll of the work.
Yeah, you can almost feel it.
Blistered hands and unshorn chins. O'Connor, and by extension the Marxist authors highlighting this quote today, are making a profound point about class identity.
Right.
They're showing where real power originates. They aren't talking about polished politicians in Westminster or, wealthy philanthropists deigning to help the poor out of charity.
Not at all.
They're emphasizing that the intellectual and organizational power to challenge the system came directly from the dirt, the grime, and the physical suffering of the factory floor.
The people doing the actual sweating.
Yes. The people whose bodies bore the literal scars of operating the means of production were the ones building the philosophy to dismantle it.
Which brings us to a specific event in the sources that really embodies that idea, this idea of power coming from the absolute lowest rungs of society.
The Match Girls.
Yes, the 1888 Match Girls strike. According to the author Stephen Domville, in July of 1888, 1,400 female workers walked out on strike at the Bryant and May factory in East London.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of Marxist analysis, we have to ask how and why this specific strike holds such a place of honor well over a century later.
Right, because on paper, this workforce had absolutely zero leverage.
Zero.
These were young women and teenage girls. They were unorganized, entirely unskilled. Society at the time viewed them as completely disposable.
Absolutely disposable.
Like, if they complained about the horrific conditions, the factory owners could just replace them the same afternoon.
Right, so how do you build solidarity when you are entirely disposable?
That's my question.
How does a group with no money, no union, and no political rights manage to strike? It seems mechanically impossible.
It does. It's like trying to organize a citywide blackout using only handwritten notes passed secretly between people who don't even know each other.
Yes, exactly. But it seems impossible until you realize the structural secret of capitalism, which these women discovered.
What was it?
The owners might have all the money and the legal power, but the owners don't actually make the matches. The women realized that while they were individually disposable as a collective, they were the absolute bottleneck of the entire enterprise.
Wow.
They stopped the machinery of a major capitalist enterprise simply by refusing to participate. They walked out, and the profit completely halted.
So they just withheld the labor power.
Exactly. It was a foundational spark. It proved that even the most vulnerable, marginalized workers could exert immense system-stopping power if they acted as a single, unified bloc.
They figured out the leverage. They realized that their blistered hands were the only things actually keeping the factory running.
Yes.
And that realization, that highly localized leverage, eventually built something massive. Because the sources note that by 1900, a man named Keir Hardie established a mass parliamentary party based directly on the foundation of those early trade unions.
The birth of the Labor Party.
Right. So they go from being an illegal underground movement with blistered hands to actually forming a political party. That is a massive jump.
It is.
Yeah.
But the Marxist texts are very careful to point out that building a political party isn't the end of the story.
No.
No, it's just moving the battlefield to a new terrain.
Okay, and that naturally leads to a massive historical transition in our timeline, because taking that raw, localized strike energy and channeling it into a formal national political structure is one thing.
Right.
But what happens to that newly organized power when the entire world is suddenly thrown into a meat grinder?
Yes.
Like, what happens when the underlying stability of the globe is completely shattered by World War?
That brings us squarely into the post-World War I era. Specifically, the massive wave of radicalization that swept across Britain between 1919 and 1920.
It was a crazy time.
Oh, incredibly volatile. Our sources, particularly Rob Sewell, paint a picture of a world teetering on the absolute brink of systemic collapse.
Really?
You have to remember the historical context here. Through the Marxist lens, millions of working-class men had just been sent to slaughter each other in the horrific trenches of World War I.
And to a Marxist, World War I wasn't a noble defense of democracy or freedom.
Not at all.
It was an imperialist war. It was empires sending the working class to die over who got to control global resources and markets.
Precisely. It was a war for profit, paid for in working-class blood. And when the traumatized survivors returned to Britain, they were not the same compliant, isolated workforce that had left.
I can imagine.
They had been trained in military logistics, they knew how to fight, and they had seen the absolute catastrophic worst of what their ruling classes were capable of orchestrating.
Yeah, the illusion was shattered. And concurrently, while they're coming home furious, the 1917 Russian Revolution had just occurred.
Yes.
The working class in Russia had actually overthrown their capitalist and aristocratic rulers.
And the psychological impact of that cannot be overstated.
It must have been huge.
It sent shockwaves globally because it proved that the theoretical ideas we've been discussing, they weren't just theories anymore.
It actually happened.
Right. A working class could actually take state power. In Britain, workers began striking in direct solidarity with the Russian Revolution. Our sources detail how British dock workers literally refused to load ships with weapons that were intended to be used by imperialist armies against the Bolsheviks in Russia.
I want to pause and make sure we define our terms clearly for the listener. We hear the word Bolshevism thrown around a lot in history classes, usually as a generic scare word.
Oh, absolutely.
In plain English, within the context of 1919, what did Bolshevism actually mean?
In plain English, the Bolsheviks were the specific Marxist faction in Russia that successfully led the 1917 revolution.
Okay.
They were the ones who organized the workers and soldiers to actually seize the state apparatus. So when the ruling classes in Britain or America talked about Bolshevism, they weren't just debating economic theory.
Right.
They were talking about the very real demonstrated threat of the working class violently overthrowing their governments and seizing the factories.
Which explains why the ruling class must have been in a state of sheer terror. I mean, there is a quote in the sources from U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, spoken in Paris in March of 1919, that perfectly captures this panic.
That's a great quote.
He said, quote, "We are running a race with Bolshevism and the world is on fire."
The world is on fire. That isn't hyperbole from Wilson.
Nope.
No, it was a completely genuine, clear-eyed assessment of the existential threat to the global capitalist order. The Marxist analysis of this period highlights that the material conditions in Britain were actually ripe for a similar revolution.
Wow.
The workers were highly militant, they were organized, and they were furious at the post-war conditions. And this tension didn't just dissipate, it built steadily year after year until it culminated in an explosion in May 1926 with the general strike.
Okay, let's talk about 1926 because the numbers here are just mind-boggling, and I really want to dig into the mechanics of this.
So do it.
According to the author James Kilby, 4 million out of a total 5.5 million trade unionists in Britain halted work for 9 days.
Incredible.
He writes that, quote, nothing moved without the workers' permission. How do 4 million people coordinate a shutdown of an entire industrialized nation?
It is a logistical miracle, honestly, and it goes right to the heart of the Marxist argument. How did they do it? They formed local strike committees or councils of action in almost every single town and city.
Just spontaneously.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Because the government and the factory owners obviously weren't going to help them, the workers had to build an alternative infrastructure overnight.
Right, because if the train stopped, the food stops. How do you keep the working class from starving during a massive strike like that?
Well, the strike committees took over.
Yeah.
The workers themselves organized local transport, they negotiated directly with farmers for food, and they managed the distribution of rations to families.
That's wild.
They even set up communication networks using dispatch riders on motorcycles to bypass the government-controlled media.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you picture the entire nation of Britain in 1926 as a complex human body, a general strike of that magnitude is like the body suddenly deciding to shut down its own nervous system.
Oh, exactly.
The brain, the government, the wealthy owners in London can send all the frantic signals at once, but if the nerves and the muscles refuse to fire, the body is completely paralyzed. It proves definitively who actually moves the limbs.
That is a brilliant analogy, and that is exactly what terrified the government. For 9 days, the formal government was essentially powerless. Power had functionally shifted to the strike committees.
Wow.
And yet, the Marxist critique of the 1926 strike, as detailed deeply in our sources, is one of profound tragedy and missed opportunity.
Really? Why?
Kilby and others argue that while the sheer terrifying power of the working class was fully on display, the strike ultimately failed to achieve a revolutionary change because of the hesitation and eventual betrayal by their own official leadership.
The Trade Union Congress, right? The TUC.
Yes.
Wait, so the workers were ready, they had the entire country paralyzed, they're running the food distribution, and their leaders blinked. Why?
This requires us to define another crucial term, reformists. The official leaders of the TUC were not revolutionaries, they were reformists.
And in plain English, a reformist is done.
A reformist is someone who believes you can fix the injustices of capitalism by slowly tweaking the rules.
Like passing a law here, negotiating a slightly better wage there.
Exactly. Without ever actually replacing the fundamental system. The Marxist texts argue that because the TUC leaders were reformists, they were inherently terrified of the very power they had just unleashed.
They didn't want a revolution.
No, they didn't want to overthrow the government. They just wanted to negotiate better terms within the existing system. But a general strike of 4 million people inherently challenges the right of the government to rule.
It's too big of a weapon.
Exactly. The TUC leaders looked over the edge into the abyss of actual revolution, panicked, and called the strike off, leaving the most militant workers, especially the miners, completely isolated to face the wrath of the state alone.
Wow. To have that much unprecedented structural power, to literally hold the fate of the nation in your hands and then just stand down because your leaders got cold feet, it really makes you wonder about the mechanics of organizing that many people. Hey, listener, do you have any other or question about this? Please write in comments so we can see and try to answer. It's just such a massive logistical feat. 4 million workers coordinating without modern technology, only to be halted by their own leadership.
It is viewed as a profound historical lesson from the Marxist perspective. It emphasizes that raw numerical power and grassroots organization just aren't enough on their own.
You need something else.
Right. The ideological clarity and resolve of the leadership are absolutely critical. If the leadership is committed to preserving the system, they will eventually act as a brake on the workers' movement.
But that hesitation and eventual capitulation in 1926 didn't just end a strike. It fundamentally shattered the workers' trust in their official leadership.
Deeply shattered it.
And that exact fracture, that deep sense of betrayal, is what sets the stage for the internal civil war we see breaking out in the labor movement as we move into the 1930s.
Exactly. The unity was shattered. And this internal fracturing was massively accelerated by the onset of the Great Depression. The sources note the infamous 1931 Labor Party split.
Right.
Rob Sewell analyzes this not just as historical trivia, but as a crucial repeating lesson regarding the nature of political establishments.
So what exactly happened in 1931?
Well, without getting bogged down in parliamentary procedure, the core issue was an economic crisis. The Great Depression hit, and the British capitalist economy was failing.
Okay.
The Labour Party was actually in government at the time.
Huh?
But instead of challenging the capitalist system that had caused the crisis, the reformist leadership of the Labour Party compromised with the conservative establishment. They agreed to implement severe austerity measures.
Let's define austerity for the listener, because that's a word that still dominates headlines today. What does austerity actually mean in practice?
Austerity is when a government drastically cuts public spending. So slashing unemployment benefits, cutting healthcare, reducing public sector wages.
All to balance the budget.
Right, to balance the budget and stabilize the capitalist economy during a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
The Marxist critique is that austerity is essentially forcing the working class to pay for the failures of the bankers and the capitalists.
Oh, wow.
In 1931, the labor leadership agreed to implement these cuts against their own working class base. It was seen as an unforgivable betrayal, splitting the party and deeply disorienting the broader movement.
But what I find fascinating reading through these archives is that even with that massive betrayal at the top, the grassroots militancy at the bottom didn't just vanish.
No, it didn't.
It adapted. There's an incredible piece in the sources by Bill Landels reflecting on a strike that happened in 1944. And the context here is absolutely wild. This is right in the middle of World War II.
Yes.
It was an apprentices' strike. Young, supposedly inexperienced workers walking out during the largest, most existential global conflict in human history.
That is a critical data point for the Marxist authors. It demonstrates a core theoretical principle. The class struggle doesn't neatly pause just because the ruling class is fighting a war.
She keeps going.
It does. Even when there is intense, overarching nationalistic pressure to produce for the war effort, the fundamental exploitation at the point of production, the reality of the means of production continues. And therefore, the resistance continues.
So the workers knew they were being exploited.
Yes. The apprentices realized they were being used as cheap labor under the guise of patriotism, and they pushed back. It shows a continuous, unbreakable thread of working-class self-education.
And that thread of self-education weaves right into 1968 to a totally different kind of strike that our sources highlight. Natasha Sorrell writes about the Dagenham machinists' strike.
Dagenham.
This was a group of women at the Ford Motor Factory striking for equal pay.
The Dagenham strike is deeply analyzed within these texts because it represents a profound maturation of the class struggle. We aren't just looking at a simple binary conflict of workers versus capitalists anymore. These female machinists were fighting against a deeply entrenched patriarchal system that existed within the working class itself.
Right, because they weren't just fighting the Ford executives for fair pay. To even get to the negotiating table, they had to fight their own union officials who didn't take women's labor seriously.
Yes.
And they had to fight against the deep-seated prejudices of their own male co-workers.
Exactly. It's a layer of complexity that the Marxist texts argue is essential for true liberation.
It's like they were fighting a multi-front war on the factory floor. It's like being a whistleblower inside a fortress.
Yeah, that's a vivid way to put it.
It's one thing to strike against the boss who owns the factory. That's difficult enough. It's entirely different when you have to strike against the boss and then turn around and fight your own union representative who is supposed to be in your corner just to prove you are actually part of the working class too.
Yes, exactly.
They had to force the labor movement to update its own operating system to recognize that exploitation isn't just about wages, it's also about gender.
A very apt description. The Marxist perspective views this not as a distraction from the broader class struggle, but as an essential deepening of it.
You can't separate them.
Right. A truly unified, revolutionary working class cannot exist if it is internally divided by gender, race, or skill level. The Dagenham women forced the movement to elevate its consciousness and address its own internal contradictions.
Which is an incredible legacy. But as massive and important as these specialized, localized strikes in the 1960s were, the sources framed them almost like pre-shocks.
Right.
Like they were just the tremors before the massive systemic earthquake that was going to hit the United Kingdom in the 1970s. We are about to look at a decade where the entire country teetered on the very edge of revolution once again. But before we dive into the absolute fire of 1972...
Yeah, let's take a breath.
By the way, if you liked and interested to the topics in the video so far, please don't forget to like, share, and comment. Also, we'd be appreciated if you subscribe to the channel to be informed about new episodes. It's also really important for us to continue this series. All right, let's step back into the narrative. If the state thought the radicalism of the 1920s was dead, the 1970s proved them entirely wrong.
Completely wrong.
The sources, specifically Rob Sewell and Ken Capstick, point to 1972 as, quote, the year of struggle and turmoil. And the statistics they provide are absolutely staggering.
They really are.
They describe a massive wave of factory occupations and sit-ins sweeping the country. Over 23 million days were lost in strike action.
To put that 23 million days figure into proper historical context, the authors note that only once in British history was the number of days lost greater, and that was the Revolutionary Year of 1919, which we discussed earlier.
So we're back to world on fire levels.
Exactly. The sheer scale of industrial action in 1972 meant that the normal functioning of the capitalist economy was literally grinding to a halt. And you mentioned a crucial tactic earlier. Factory occupations.
Yeah, that's different from a strike, right?
Very different. Workers weren't just walking out and picketing on the sidewalk. They were physically taking control of the means of production.
Let's explore the mechanics of that. How does a factory occupation actually work, and why is it so much more threatening to the establishment than just a standard strike?
Well, in a standard strike, you withdraw your labor and hope the economic pain forces the boss to negotiate.
Right.
But in an occupation, the workers lock the boss out. They take physical possession of the workspace. This is terrifying to the capitalist class because it violates the absolute sanctity of private property.
Oh, I see.
It shows the workers practically demonstrating that they don't actually need the owners to run the facility. It is a direct physical challenge to the question of who truly owns the wealth of society.
And the conservative government at the time was visibly panicking over this shift in tactics. The sources mention a specific Tory pamphlet called In Defense of Peace, written by a military man named Brigadier Kitson.
Yes, the Kitson.
And in this officially circulated pamphlet, he is openly urging the British Army to prepare for widespread civil unrest. He is telling the military to get ready to operate inside the UK.
This specific detail regarding Brigadier Kitson is heavily emphasized in the Marxist analysis because it goes to the very heart of how they view the concept of the state.
Okay, let's unpack the Marxist view of the state, because usually we think of the state as just neutral referees, the police, the courts, the government, making sure everyone plays fair.
Right, but Marxist theory fundamentally rejects that idea of neutrality. In Marxist theory, the state is defined essentially as armed bodies of men.
Armed bodies of men.
Yes. The military, the police, the prisons.
Yeah.
Whose primary historical function is to protect the property and the dominance of the ruling class.
Wow.
When the working class operates within the normal, quiet, obedient boundaries of society, the state appears peaceful and neutral. But what Brigadier Kitson's pamphlet reveals is the iron fist inside the velvet glove.
The mask slips.
Exactly. When the organized labor movement genuinely threatens the economic status quo, when millions of workers start occupying factories and ignoring the property laws, the capitalist state will immediately drop the pretense of neutrality. They will ready the military to suppress their own citizens to protect the system.
So what does this all mean? It reminds me of a massive industrial pressure cooker.
Okay, yeah.
The standard union negotiations, the occasional authorized polite strike, those are the safety valves. They let off just enough steam to keep the system running smoothly without exploding.
Right.
But in 1972, those safety valves were blocked. Or they just weren't enough anymore. The heat kept rising, the pressure kept building, and the government realized the entire vessel was in danger of a catastrophic systemic explosion.
A total blowout.
Exactly. They were prepping the military because they thought the pressure cooker was about to take off the roof.
And we can connect this dread right back to our earlier discussion.
Here.
The authors explicitly draw a line from Woodrow Wilson's existential panic in 1919. The world is on fire, to the sheer dread of the British establishment in 1972.
It's the same fear.
The exact same fear. The ruling class felt that terror. The specter of revolution, of the working class actually seizing power, had returned.
But if the state realized they were sitting on a pressure cooker in 1972, they didn't just turn off the heat.
No, they did not.
They decided to dismantle the entire stove. because the revolution didn't happen in the 70s. Instead, what the sources detail is that the ruling class survived, regrouped, and then organized a devastating, highly calculated, and brutal counteroffensive in the 1980s.
Yes, a massive counteroffensive.
Which brings us to an era defined by a titanic, deeply personal clash. The Iron Lady, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, versus the organized working class.
The 1980s are presented in these archives as a period of brutal, existential, and largely defensive battles for the labor movement. But it is vital to understand that it didn't start with total defeat.
It didn't.
No. Mike Hogan's account of Liverpool in the early 80s highlights a moment of intense, highly successful resistance.
Tell me about Liverpool.
Marxist labor counselors actually took the political leadership in the city of Liverpool, building a massive, highly mobilized movement of working-class communities to directly oppose savage budget cuts imposed by Thatcher's central government.
They essentially said, we refuse to implement your austerity.
Yes. It was a localized, highly militant stand that proved that when leadership is bold and willing to defy the state, the working class will rally behind them.
But while Liverpool was a beacon, the defining conflict of this era, the one that cast a long, dark shadow over everything else, was the Great Miners' Strike of 1984 and 1985.
The miners' strike, yeah.
The author Ian Isaac reflects on this extensively, and the sources describe it as a semi-insurrectionary struggle against Margaret Thatcher's government. But, tragically, for the labor movement, it was ultimately unsuccessful.
The Great Miners' Strike is perhaps the most analyzed, most traumatic defeat in modern British labor history. From the perspective of our sources, this wasn't just a localized dispute over closing a few unprofitable coal pits.
What was it then?
It was a deliberate, highly strategic class war waged by the Thatcher government.
How so? What was the strategy?
Well, the miners were traditionally the vanguard. They were the absolute strongest and most militant union in the country. They had the power to literally turn the lights off in Britain by stopping the coal supply.
Right, because everything ran on coal.
Exactly. Thatcher's government understood that if they could break the miners, they could break the entire trade union movement.
Right.
So they planned for it. They stockpiled coal for months in advance. They militarized the police to physically crush the picket lines. And they used the courts to seize union funds.
So they starved them out.
They did. The miners fought with incredible heroism for an entire year, enduring severe police violence, media demonization, and literal economic starvation in their communities. But entirely isolated by the cautious leaders of the broader TUC, they were ultimately defeated.
And the aftermath of that defeat was just devastating across the board. The sources point out that after the massive oak tree of the miners fell, the rest of the forest was clear-cut.
That's a sad but accurate way to put it.
The dockers and the print workers were also violently defeated in the late 1980s. Ben Gliniecki provides a statistic that really anchors this devastation. Union membership in Britain plummeted from 13.2 million in 1979 down to just 6.2 million.
It literally halved.
They quite literally cut the movement in half.
What we are looking at here is the Marxist exploration of what they call the dialectic of victory and defeat.
Wait, dialectic is a heavy philosophical word? In plain English, what does the dialectic of victory and defeat actually mean for the people living through it?
Okay, in plain English, it means that history is not a straight, smooth line of endless progress.
It's not just things getting better and better.
No.
Yeah.
It moves through intense contradictions, clashes, and fierce reactions. Imagine a spiral rather than a straight line. The working class pushes forward, gains power, and then the capitalist class reacts with immense force to push them back. The defeat of the industrial unions in the 80s dismantled the traditional heavy industry power base that had defined the labor movement since the 1920s. It was a historic trauma that profoundly altered the balance of class power.
It's like my earlier forest fire analogy. Those massive old-growth trees, the deeply entrenched, highly organized industrial unions that had been growing and building power for a century were deliberately chopped down and burned out by government policies.
Yes.
The landscape of the working class looked entirely barren, but the fire wasn't completely out because right at the end of the decade, in 1990, something completely different springs up from the ashes, the anti-poll tax movement.
Yes. Rob Sewell's piece on the poll tax is absolutely vital here because it shows the resilience of the class struggle.
What was the poll tax?
So, Margaret Thatcher, feeling invincible after crushing the unions, tried to introduce a flat-rate tax. Mechanically, this meant that a fabulously wealthy duke living in a mansion would pay the exact same local tax as a struggling street sweeper living in a tiny flat.
It was essentially a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, and it was seen as grotesquely unfair.
Precisely. And what happened? On March 31st, 1990, 250,000 people demonstrated in London and Glasgow. But it wasn't just a march. The true power was a quiet, relentless campaign of mass, organized civil disobedience.
Explain the mechanics of that non-payment campaign. How did it actually work?
Millions of people simply refused to pay the tax. They overwhelmed the court systems. When bailiffs came to seize the property of people who hadn't paid, entire neighborhoods would mobilize to physically block the bailiffs from entering the homes.
Just human blockades.
Yes. It was grassroots, street-by-street defense.
And the most fascinating part of this, according to the text, is who was actually leading this massive logistical resistance. It wasn't the official trade union Congress. It wasn't the official Labour Party leadership in Parliament either. In fact, the sources say the official leadership, quote, lamentably opposed the resistance because it broke the law. The movement was instead led by the All-Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation, with a group called the Militant Tendency playing a leading role.
Let's define the militant tendency for clarity. This was a highly organized Marxist group operating deeply inside the broader labor movement.
Okay.
While the official reformist leaders were telling people to obey the law and pay the unfair tax, the militant tendency provided the radical strategy, the printing presses, and the organizational framework that the official leaders refused to provide.
So even after having their industrial numbers cut in half, the working class proved they could still leverage mass civil disobedience to take down a prime minister who seemed completely invincible.
Yes, because the fact that millions wouldn't pay made the tax entirely uncollectible.
And that exact failure directly led to the Conservative Party forcing Margaret Thatcher to resign. That is a wild pendulum swing of history.
It really is.
So how do you go from that massive grassroots victory in 1990 to the fractured, highly complex political landscape we see today? How does this history inform the 21st century?
This brings us to the final section of our sources, examining the modern battlefield from 2008 to 2019. Alan Woods writes an obituary for a foundational figure named Ted Grant, emphasizing that the Marxist ideas we've been tracking, the understanding of class struggle, didn't simply die when the Soviet Union fell in the 90s.
Right.
They endured because capitalism endured. But the real catalyst for the modern era was the 2008 global financial crisis.
Right, because 2008 shattered the illusion that modern financialized capitalism had somehow solved the boom and bust cycle.
Precisely. The Marxist texts argue that the post-2008 era of vicious austerity, bank bailouts, and unending capitalist crisis sparked a massive reinvigoration of the labor movement.
People were angry again.
Yes. A new generation of workers and youth, facing bleak economic prospects, crushing debt, and stagnant wages, began searching for radical alternatives to the status quo. This rising tide culminated in 2015 with what the sources describe as a political earthquake.
The election of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, the election of the staunch left-winger Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party.
The sources describe Britain at this point as transforming into a field of ferocious class struggle. They call the oldest parliamentary democracy an open battlefield between an energized coalition of workers and youth on one side and a desperate, deeply entrenched capitalist class on the other.
That's how they viewed it.
But then history spirals again. We hit 2019. Rob Sewell writes about the crushing victory of Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. And Sewell specifically points out who was celebrating this massive defeat of the left.
This is a crucial detail.
Donald Trump tweeted his enthusiastic congratulations, and the Financial Times literally exuded joy as the value of the pound rose on the foreign exchange markets.
By analyzing exactly who celebrates a political defeat, the Marxist framework attempts to identify the true underlying nature of the conflict.
Okay.
The joy of Donald Trump, a billionaire U.S. president, and the relief of the Financial Times, which is the literal journal of international finance capital, ties Boris Johnson's victory directly to the imperialist and capitalist interests that the labor movement fundamentally opposes.
It clarifies the battle lines.
Exactly. The wealthy celebrated because their property was safe from redistribution.
But I have to push back here, based on the numbers and the history the sources themselves just provided us.
Okay, let's hear it.
They said union membership dropped from 13 million down to 6 million. The great industrial forests were clear-cut. If the traditional industrial base is gone, if the coal mines are closed and the massive Ford factories are shipped overseas, is this idea of an open battlefield just theoretical rhetoric?
That's a fair question.
I mean, how does modern precarious gig work people driving Ubers, delivering food on bicycles, working on zero-hour contracts fit into this grand historical framework of massive 19th century factory strikes? Are we just comparing apples to ghosts at this point?
That is the most critical, penetrating question we can ask, and answering it requires synthesizing the entire arc of our sources today.
Let's do it.
I want you to look back at the very beginning of our deep dive. The 1888 match girls.
Okay.
They weren't protected by strong traditional unions. They didn't have massive pensions or secure jobs. They were unskilled, precarious, highly marginalized, and entirely disposable workers.
They were essentially the gig workers of the Victorian era.
Exactly. The Marxist analysis suggests history is forming a loop. The heavy industrial unions of the mid-20th century may be severely diminished, but the fundamental relationship to the means of production remains completely unchanged.
I see.
Today's precarious gig economy workers, the logistics drivers, the warehouse packers, they face the exact same basic structural exploitation as the 19th century pioneers. The battlefield isn't rhetorical. The terrain is simply shifted. We move from the soot-covered coal mine to the sterile logistics warehouse and the algorithmic digital platform.
So the blistered hands O'Connor talked about just look a little different now.
Yes.
They might be carpal tunnel from a keyboard or exhausted legs from a delivery bike, but the core engine of the struggle, the friction between the people doing the work and the people taking the profit, is the exact same.
Exactly. The mechanism is unbroken.
Yeah.
And that leaves us with a lingering, deeply provocative thought that builds on everything these historical archives have shown us today.
What's that?
If the magnificent, terrifying power of the 1926 general strike relied on massive, centralized industrial hubs, millions of workers physically shutting down the mines, the docks, and the railways in person, how would a 21st century general strike actually function?
Right. If the power in 1926 was physical proximity, where does the power lie now?
Precisely. In a modern world defined by remote work, highly fragmented digital gig economies, and impossibly complex, just-in-time globalized supply chains, where exactly are the new choke points?
That's a great question.
If the workers of today wanted to shut down the nervous system of modern capitalism, how does a decentralized digital working class flip the breaker?
That is a phenomenal question to leave hanging in the air. How do you stop the machine when the machine is everywhere and nowhere at once? I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and here's the solid place to finish the episode. Thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, share, and comment. You can check the link in the description to listen to the full History of Revolution podcast playlist. We're grateful you're here. Take care until next time.